start the program, and I want to start out with telling you that tonight is our 37th soup supper, and it's the beginning of our 13th year of presenting soup suppers. And we're very fortunate tonight to have as our speaker Gary Gardner, a newly elected member of the Desert Hot Springs City Council. Gary moved to Desert Hot Springs from Seattle, although he's originally from Salt Lake City, Utah, where he earned a BA in political science from Brigham Young University. He also has a master's degree in public administration from Arizona State. He worked for 30 years as a political and policy consultant. I don't know what that means, but it sounds good.
It's a lobbyist.
It's a lobbyist, he said. He also has worked as an on-air personality for radio and TV stations. Okay, he's traveled the country on his motorcycle, and he's currently working on a book about his travels. He's also an accomplished photographer who likes to focus on abandoned places along the highways. And he has contributed one of the items for our raffle tonight, and it's one of his art photographs. And you need to see the back of it because it's already on a metal frame ready to hang. And he sells them in galleries, so this is really, really a special gift for our raffle. You can view his work at the Brian Markey Gallery in Palm Springs, as well as a number of other galleries across the country. And let's see. Gary says one of the first things he did when he moved to Desert Hot Springs was to join the Historical Society. Yay, Gary. He says he's fascinated with history, especially mining and railroad history, ghost towns and abandoned mines. So, we are privileged to have him here tonight to talk about Henry Kaiser's Eagle Mountain Mine and Railroad. You're on, Gary.
Well, thank you. Boy, I'm flattered with the turnout here tonight. I'm surprised you're not all at the planning session for the new park that's going in across the street. Probably where the rest of the city council is, but I see Jan here, so thank you. Do you want to dim the lights a little bit? As long as I have enough that I can read, you'll be able to see the pictures a little bit better. Do we have a way of dimming the lights a little bit? Can you all see? So, Ivan knows where the light switch is. Or who to ask anyway. So. All right, well, thank you for coming tonight. I'm honored to be here. I'm really excited about this presentation. But then again, history and things like abandoned mines and rusty rails going nowhere and big industrial things tend to excite me. Doesn't take much. For as long as I can remember growing up in Utah and Wyoming, I loved exploring old mines and railroads. I'd be hard-pressed to find an abandoned railroad in the West that I've not explored, usually with my closest friend in the world who also enjoys these things. He's here tonight, Dave Harmer. Wave, Dave. This picture is from one of our trips. All right, why is my clicker not clicking? Yeah, this picture is from one of our trips when we did the Tennessee Pass line through Colorado, which was the original line across the Rockies quite a couple of 3 years ago. I'm also lucky to have a partner who tolerates and even sometimes embraces my love of rusty things in the desert, Eric Harris. Eric? Both of them were on this exploratory trip that led to tonight's presentation, which grew out of a post on my blog called In the Nick of Time that I shared with Audrey, who felt it was something worthy of the soup supper. And like Audrey said, joining the DHS Historical Society was one of the first things I did when I moved here. I've always loved history and doing historical research, especially when it comes to things like mines and railroads and industry. It's something I really enjoy. And I love the story behind abandoned places where people once lived, laughed, worked, loved, played, where they were born and died, and the only sign left of life once lived is what's left behind when they moved on. And tonight we're going to talk about and explore a guy I consider a fascinating individual who is a major imprint on our part of the desert, and it's still with us today, and will be here long after all of us become dust in the wind. We'll take a closer look at his mining and railroad operation in the desert east of here. A lot of the pictures you'll see tonight I took, some of which are available in galleries, and the rest were grabbed off the internet. And you know, you'll know the old history ones, obviously, that are older than me. I didn't do. I first became intrigued with this mine and railroad when I began wintering in the desert when I retired in 2013. One day while I was on a motorcycle trip over to Phoenix for a few days, headed east on the 10, I crossed over some rusty railroad tracks out near Desert Center. Like I said, there's nothing like a set of rusty railroad tracks that makes me want to go explore and see where they go. So I exited off the 10 and turned my trusty bike Angus down and to the tracks, and the rusty sagebrush, creosote bush choked railroad grabbed my attention. And I remembered reading somewhere in the past that this was a line that went to an iron mine. And so I took these two pictures and I filed it away in my mind for a time when I could do some research. And as we all know, historical research tends to be like going down a rabbit hole. You never know where you're going to end up. And if you spend any time looking into the 20th century history of our area, you come across the name Henry Kaiser. Kaiser was born in 1882 in upstate New York to some German immigrant parents. He worked as an apprentice photographer early in life, but by the time he was in his 20s, he'd used his savings to move to Washington State, where he started a construction company that made its fortune building and paving roads for the state of Washington. And then he married his wife Bess, who was from Spokane. His firm grew in the early 20s, even building roads in Cuba, but his big break came when he joined forces with 5 other companies to form a major construction company called Six Companies Inc., who built Hoover Dam. His name is still very prominent on the construction plaque at Hoover Dam. They went on to build Grand Coulee Dam in Washington, Parker Dam on the Colorado, as well as the Colorado River Aqueduct for the LA Metropolitan Water District. And as you know, if you come to an earlier soup supper presentation that my good friend Jeff Bowman did, the Colorado River Aqueduct passes through the hills of Desert Hot Springs. And the remains of his construction camps for when they were building that aqueduct are still in our side canyons today. We could spend a long time talking about Henry and his life and his many accomplishments, but we'll leave that for another night. It could be a doctoral thesis if we wanted to, but I did want to note a couple of things about Henry. On the one end of the spectrum, he was quite the forward thinker. Among his innovations was the first health maintenance organization, or HMO, which came to life down the road in Desert Center. We know it today as Kaiser Permanente, which my good friend Larry retired from after many years. It's still providing health care for thousands of people along the West Coast. Originally it was set up just for Kaiser's employees at his mines, mills, factories, and shipyards. And at one time there was a monument on the site of Kaiser's first hospital in Desert Center. And that site's now a California historical landmark. However, those lovely metal thieves that are all out there stealing copper and other things in the past few years have stolen the plaque from its original site. So it was relocated to Chirocco Summit, where it's not so prone to thieves, and you can see it up there. And on the other end of the political spectrum, good old Henry was the inspiration for Ayn Rand's novel Atlas Shrugged. In her notes, she took the train out to see Kaiser's operations when she was researching the novel, and in a nod to his help, she named the steel magnate Henry, and the blast furnace in his novel was named Bess, which was Kaiser's wife. So, after building dams and the aqueduct, Henry, who loved boats and ships, set up shipyards in Seattle and Portland, where he began using mass production techniques such as welding instead of rivets in building his ships. This was just prior to World War II, when the U.S. was trying to stay out of the fighting, but also supplying Europe with a lot of food and exports, and thus needed a lot of ships. And Henry's firm built more Liberty ships than any other shipbuilder. And we all know we didn't stay out of the war very long, and the demand for ships increased even more, so Henry's now building ships like mad. And back then, all the steel in the U.S. was produced on the East Coast. And he soon figured out that he could build ships quicker and cheaper if he had a source of steel on the West Coast. So he built the first integrated steel mill on the West Coast, just west of us here in Fontana, with construction starting in 1940 and the first steel produced in 1943. It was built quite a ways inland to protect it from marauding Japanese ships. And now, if you know anything about steel, they need lots of coal, and they need iron ore, and they need limestone. And Henry figured that if he mined his own ore and coal, he'd be better able to control his steel making, and so Kaiser Steel came into existence, and they went into the mining business too, first taking on a claim in the Mojave Desert just outside of Kelso, California. Now, all of us have ridden the back road to Las Vegas. You should recognize this. It's the Kelso Depot on the Union Pacific Los Angeles and Salt Lake line, and it's now home to the visitor center for the Mojave National Preserve. But back in the early 40s, this was a major rail stop along the line, and about 10 miles to the south of Kelso was the Vulcan mining claim. And Henry took that over, and a pit mine was developed, digging out iron ore and trucking it to Kelso, where it was loaded on trains, shipped over Cajon Pass down to Fontana. And today, you can still drive the old truck road up from Kelso, and you'll find the remains of the mine in this empty pit where they dug the ore out. Well, the Vulcan claim soon played out, and by 1947 it had shipped 2.6 million tons of ore, and the Fontana mill had grown to become the second largest steel mill in the West behind Geneva Steel in Provo, Utah, which ironically is also abandoned and torn down now. Henry needed more ore, so he took over another claim, this one at Eagle Mountain, just east of us. 13 miles north of the mapped out town of Desert Center. It was an old gold mine, actually, but Henry didn't want the gold, he wanted the iron ore, which was actually troublesome for the gold miners, which is why they left. The Eagle Mountain town and mine were founded in 1948, just outside the east side of Joshua Tree National Monument. And later, when they expanded the monument, made it Joshua Tree National Park, they had to carve the mine area out because it was still active. Now, did anybody else see a shape of a gun there? I had an environmentalist friend point that out to me to say that the mine, the abandoned mine in the town was like a gun shooting into the heart of Joshua Tree National Park. For coal, Henry turned to the Utah Fuel Company, and he took a minority ownership in it, bought his coking coal from their mine in Sunnyside, Utah, in the appropriate name Carbon County. The coal was shipped from the mine on the Carbon County Railway, which he also had a part ownership with, to a connection in Provo, and then down here to Fontana. And now we're going to go down another one of these rabbit holes. A few years before I moved to the desert, Dave and I explored the remains of this mine and the Carbon County Railway. But it wasn't until I stumbled upon the Eagle Mountain mine and railroad and started researching Kaiser that the puzzle pieces all came together, bringing us full circle back. It's one of those moments as a historical researcher that makes it so fun. It's kind of like putting a jigsaw puzzle together, but without knowing what the picture is going to be when you're starting. Anyway, back to Eagle Mountain. The mine opened up in 1948, and the town grew to a peak population of about 4,000. Now you can see here in this shot, taken shortly after the town was laid out in the mine pit, which is right here, was just barely started. You can even see a short train on the railroad that they had just started. You see them down there? Henry had to build the railroad because the mine was a significant distance from the main line of the Southern Pacific Railroad, and the roads in the 40s through the desert and down the San Gorgonio Pass just weren't capable of supporting an endless stream of trucks carrying ore. So Henry built himself a private railroad, the Eagle Mountain Railroad. At the time, it was the longest railroad construction project in the United States. Brand new railroad from the mine up here, 51 miles through the desert, up and over the pass, and back down to the Southern Pacific along the Salton Sea, just north of the Riverside County, Imperial County line. And they named the spot where they connected the railroad Ferrum Junction, which if you speak Latin, means iron. Construction started in 1947 and was completed a year later. The railroad became one of the longest private railroads in the country, and it's remarkable that it was completed in a year given the engineering obstacles getting over the mountain to the Southern Pacific, the desolation, and the extreme desert temperatures. All in all, it cost a whopping $4 million to build. In 1947, that was quite a bit of money. At the height of production in the early 1960s, when the mine was going like crazy, they would run two 100-car ore trains from the mine each day. One would go to the mill at Fontana, the other would go to the port of Long Beach for shipment to some overseas mills. The Eagle Mountain Railroad would haul the trains to Ferrum, where the Southern Pacific would forward them on to Montana or Long Beach, and then they'd bring the empties back. The Eagle Mountain Railroad would haul them back to the mine for reloading. The ore cars, which you see there along the siding, this is at Ferrum, where they come down from the mountain and they park them there, and the Southern Pacific would then come pick them up, were used in captive service only for the mine, and they were built by the Southern Pacific Railroad up in Sacramento. They also built a couple of cabooses, or caboose, I don't know what the plural of it would be, one of which is displayed in a little park off of the I-10 at Desert Center, and it's still there with some trees growing out of it and some graffiti, and it's the main road to the Eagle Mountain Mine. The railroad was entirely single track, which meant only one train at a time could go, with the exception of a mile-long siding at the top of the grade, about halfway between the mine and the sea, where trains could pass each other. They start at milepost 1 at Ferrum, ending at milepost 51 at the mine. Coming down from the mine past the town was the steepest part of the line at about milepost 47 with a 2.1% grade. This section is called Caution Hill because all the loaded trains coming down from the mine had to wait at the bottom of the grade for 5 minutes to cool their brakes for a runaway in case the brakes failed. This train is sitting at the bottom of Caution Hill waiting for its brakes to cool. If you look, there's some smoke back there at the end of the train. And you see the mine up there in the background. And yet, here's another puzzle piece in our historical jigsaw puzzle, our portrait of Henry, and his impact on our area. And you see this bridge here? It's really not over a wash or anything natural at all. It's over the Colorado River Aqueduct. It was thought that the heavy trains might damage it, so they built a bridge over it. Who built the aqueduct? Henry Kaiser. So here we see two of his projects crossing each other. In the 1970s, steel production in this country waned, environmental concerns, and steel imports from foreign countries. And so the Fontana mill didn't have such a ferocious appetite for ore anymore, and they started abandoning bits and pieces of it, closing it off. From the early 70s till the early 80s, one 100-car train was dispatched every day. And by 1981, half the Fontana mill was idle, and Kaiser announced the closure of the mine and the mill itself. And so nowadays, you can see when they closed half of it off, it's a NASCAR track down in Fontana, and they put some industrial buildings down here. And by this time, there's nobody left at the mine, nothing's coming down, and the town of Eagle Mountain dwindled to about 150 people. 1982, the post office closed, shipments were down to 3 to 5 trains a week with as few as 40 cars. The mine itself closed in 83, but shipments of already mined ore continued till the mill closed in 85. And there was still a fair amount of leftover ore at this point, which was shipped to Long Beach for sale overseas over the next year, until it too was all gone, with the last ore train running in March in 1986. And shortly after that last run, the railroad was set for a movie. In March of April of '86, Touchstone Films, a Disney subsidiary, filmed the movie Tough Guys. Anybody remember that movie? It was a big hit. I'm being sarcastic here, but it was a comedy that starred Burt Lancaster, Kirk Douglas, Eli Wallach, and Dana Carvey. It was the final collaboration for Burt and Kirk Douglas. They played a pair of train robbers who have been released from prison after 30 years. Unable to survive in the changed world, they decided to rob the same train they robbed 30 years ago. And at the end of the film, they hijacked the Gold Coast Flyer, pulled by this restored Southern Pacific steam locomotive, and run at full throttle towards the Mexican border. There's old Kirk standing on top, headed up the pass, pretending to be the Mexican border. Through the early 90s, Kaiser Ventures did some minimal maintenance on the railway to keep it up in case the market turned around. But some large storms in the mid-90s washed out large sections of the tracks, and since then, nothing's happened. Well, the end had come for the Eagle Mountain Mine and Railroad. You see both of them there in the background. The rails in the mine sat out there waiting and rusting in the desert for the next 32 years. And there have been some projects proposed. A huge landfill for the mining pits was something that was debated for quite some time. They'd revived the railroad, shipping the trash from LA to be buried in these gaping holes in the mountain. But opposition from environmentalists, increased recycling efforts, and other things doomed the idea, and it went nowhere. And now there's talk of using the pits for an energy project, storing water in the upper pit here and then running it into the lower pit down there to generate electricity during high demand times when solar and wind power aren't being produced, and then using solar power to pump the water back up to the upper pit. In effect, kind of like a big battery out there, but it's a way of generating green energy. But there would be no need for the railway. This view is from Joshua Tree. There's a road up at the top of Joshua Tree. If you take the Cottonwood entrance out and you see a road called Black Mesa or Black Canyon Mine, it'll take you to that overlook. Now jumping ahead to 2013, when I first saw those tracks headed across the desert, I started digging into the history. In 2016, when I moved here full-time, Dave and Eric and I set out on a little expedition to explore what was left of the mine. We spent an entire Saturday out 4x4ing in the Hummer across the desert, following the tracks, seeing what was left of the Eagle Mountain Mine, the town of Eagle Mountain, and the Eagle Mountain Railroad. The town is now completely fenced off, as is the mine. You can see a little bit through the fence, and there's some holes that you can shoot through, but it's secure. And we couldn't find anybody to let us in. But the railroad's out there, and we spent the day following it. There's some pretty wild washouts, and the power of the water twisting and bending the rails, which made for some really cool photographs. There's some abandoned structures along the line where they had maintenance vehicles and things like that. And there's this spectacular spindly trestle over the Salt Creek Wash, the highest and longest on the railroad. In many places, the tracks were in absolutely fine condition, ready for a train to roll down them, complete with crossing warning signs. Yet in a lot of other places, it was completely washed out or covered with sand. At the end of the line down in Ferrum, you don't even connect to the Union Pacific Main Line anymore. UP disconnecting the tracks when they double-tracked the area a few years ago. They neglected to even tell the Kaiser people that they'd done so. So for 32 years, almost longer than they were used, the tracks sat out there quietly, rusting, baking out in the desert. No rumbling locomotives, no clickety-clack of the wheels over rail joints, no horns blowing for the occasional crossing, just an iron road to nowhere, marching across the Mojave Desert, serving no one. It's a very sad ending to a mine and a railroad that were a significant factor in the growth and prosperity of Southern California, and a reason for the explosive growth in those post-war years. But you know, the story doesn't end there. It actually kind of gets a little bit sadder. A month after Dave and I and Eric explored the length of the old Eagle Mountain, Eric and I were headed back from the Frida Kahlo exhibit at the Phoenix Art Museum, and we decided to stop again and do some more exploring and photography, and we were quite surprised. We exited off the 10 and found that somebody had come along and pulled up all of the spikes, all the railroad joints, removed all the fasteners, and as we got closer and closer to the mine itself, there were backhoes and crawlers removing the rail itself. You know, it's understandable that what's left of the Kaiser Industrial Empire would want to recoup some value. That's an awful lot of steel out there, and it has significant scrap value. 51 miles of railroad can be recycled into an awful lot of new steel things. The line would never be used again, so why not get something of value? So pulling it up makes economic sense. So through the summer of 2017, bit by bit, mile by mile, the old Eagle Mountain Railroad was torn up. The rails lifted, the wooden cross ties dug up and carted away. You can see some mountains of ties and rails stacked up off the 10 at Desert Center still. They even took away the ties and culverts from one of the washouts. So that's just completely gone now, except for the old road bed. The tracks sat unused for nearly more years than they were used, and now they're almost gone as well. And if we keep taking them up, in another 30 years, there'll be no trace left of the old Eagle Mountain Railroad, just the ghost of the old road bed. A slight scar across the landscape and an occasional old mile marker that pretty much meaningless now. But it's still an enjoyable drive, and today you can drive along much of the old rail bed as it climbs up to the summit. No ties or rails to impede you, and you can use your imagination and pretend you're an engineer on a 100-car Kaiser steel ore train driving across the beauty of our Mojave Desert. Eric and I have driven across much of it we can in the Hummer from the Red Cloud Mine exit off of I-10 westward, just about 15 miles, till we came to a giant washout that even the trusty Hummer couldn't quite make it across. The company taking up the track stopped just a little bit past that washout. Roadbed and even crossing signs and tracks are still there, all the way down to Ferrum. These guys were ambitious and they built stuff on the cheap, but it lasted. The pole is an old rail that they painted white. You hit that thing, you're going to wreck your car more than knock it over. It's not going anywhere. I'm not sure if or when they'll keep taking things down on the rest of the tracks now, but 15 miles of track remain, and it's in pretty good shape, except for a few washouts. It's a testament to how well it was constructed, too. As you recall, those tracks, I said, were first laid in 1947, and upon close inspection of the rails that are still left, much of the line was relaid with heavier new rail in the 60s, the height of production when the mine was running 2 100-car trains a day loaded with ore and 2 trains back. You can see this rail was built in 1962 and 1964. Ironically, they didn't use Kaiser-owned steel. If you think about it, owning a steel mill would give you a pretty good deal on rails, but apparently Kaiser didn't have the machines to mill steel into rail, so they bought their steel from Colorado Iron and Foundry in Colorado Springs in the 60s, but it's still out there. The big trestle across Salt Creek Wash is still there. It'll be there for a long time, I think. It's a handy place for folks out enjoying their sand rails to park in the shade. And a few of them actually scamper up and make the courageous walk across. And the tracks still head down towards the Salton Sea to the spot where they once connected to the Southern Pacific, now Union Pacific. At Ferrum, there's an old maintenance shed. It still stands. It's visible off Highway 111 a bit north of the turnoff to Bombay Beach. And it could very well outlast all of us too. These guys were ambitious and creative. They built it out of scrap rail, the entire thing, the walls, the ceiling, the beams across, all scrap rail. The old sheds at the I-10 overpass are still up there too. They've been covered with some colorful graffiti. The bridge across the Colorado River Aqueduct still there, as is the aqueduct running underneath it. They both outlasted Henry, the mines, the town, and the railroad too. And the bridge over the Coachella Canal, still there, proudly letting us know who built it and who once owned the railroad. All in all, it makes for a pleasant Sunday outing in the desert, driving or hiking on the old roadbed, occasional milepost still marking the distance from Ferrum, although there's no tracks here anymore. No sign of a railroad really, but maybe if you listen closely in your mind, you might still hear the ghost of a rail whistle blowing for a crossing out in the desert. And that makes me a little sad. It's all but gone now. Compare the photo on the left, which was my first view of the Eagle Mountain Railroad, to the one on the right, was taken last week. And you know, in my head, I understand why they took up the rails, but in my heart, I really want the tracks to remain. I want to return in the years ahead to see the steel winding its way across the desert, see the wild lupine growing in the tracks along the spring and the summer. Remember what it once symbolized, the power of men to literally move mountains. That's the pit today. They moved a mountain. Men to dream big, to create an empire of coal, iron ore, and steel, of railroads and mills and shipyards, literally scar the landscape, as well as a testament to the industrial genius that was Henry Kaiser. If you like what you saw, my blog address is up there, and my photography website is there, and you can go to the Brian Marquis Fine Art Gallery in downtown Palm Springs as well. Check out some of the pieces there. Any questions? Thank you for listening and staying awake, and I think it's time for our raffles, right?
No questions? Yes.
No questions. Anybody have any questions? Oh, way back there. I'm sorry.
It's okay. One of your earlier photographs showed kind of a camp that was Kaiser's.
Yeah.
Was that camp or new?
That was one of the construction camps. There was a cement plant there, and it's up. If you live over by I'm drawing a blank now. The country club, by Mission Lakes Country Club, the canyon that goes up the side of that, up Little Morongo Road. If you follow it up and keep going up, you'll run into that. And That's where that's at. And it was at one time a cement mixing plant for the canal, which actually runs in a tunnel almost all the way from Sirocco Summit through the hills, all back through here. And that's where you find those big hatches, and there's some vent pipes and a few other things that'll be marked CRA with a set of numbers on it, which will tell you how many miles it is from Parker Dam. But it goes through there, and that entire canal, especially when it comes west and goes underneath Indian Canyon and heads over towards the Whitewater area, that's all in a cement-lined trench that's then been covered with dirt. And so they had to have a place to mix the cement, and that's where they did that.
I see. Do you know Camp Purdue? Do you know anything about Camp Purdue?
What's that?
I thought it was
No, Camp Purdue is up Purdue Canyon, which is, it's still in our general area, but Purdue Canyon takes off. If you take Dillon Road all the way out, and just about where it turns and drops down into Coachella, you'll see Purdue Canyon taking up off to the left. And done that in the Hummer. I wouldn't advise it if you had anything less than a Jeep or a Hummer, because it's really an amazing road, but you've got to have the vehicle to go up it.
Was Kaiser instrumental in the building of that camp, I thought?
What's that?
Was Kaiser instrumental in the building of
Yeah,
that camp?
Kaiser was one of the companies that built with 6 Companies Inc. that built the Colorado River Aqueduct and all of the pumping stations and the canal itself. So he actually was responsible, his company was partly responsible mostly in the area around here, but all 6 of those companies, and big names that you'd recognize rather, like Bechtel and stuff, were all part of the 6 companies. Now somebody over here, oh, hi Carol.
Hi there. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and Richmond, California had a Kaiser shipyard there, right?
Yep, we had
And-
shipyards down here
Yeah,
too.
and I did a nursing rotation at the Kaiser Clinic there in Richmond.
Yep.
For their first HMO. Was it the first in California or their first HMO?
Yep.
But
he
it
had
was-
shipyards down
yeah,
here.
yeah.
He had quite the empire, and we didn't even touch on his aluminum. Kaiser Aluminum had quite a few operations up in Washington where they had, aluminum takes an awful lot of electric power, and so they have all of the dams across the Columbia that provide really cheap electrical power. So all of his aluminum plants were located there along the Columbia, and I believe that Kaiser Aluminum is still in existence, but I think it's one of the last remaining pieces of his empire.
Well, and the HMO, Kaiser HMO,
Yep.
was the first HMO in the country.
It was the very first one. It started, they started with the workers for the Aqueduct, and they had the hospital out there by Desert Center. And I've been trying to find, I've been looking at some satellite pictures, and I want to go out there, and I guess the foundations are still there, but I'd love to go out there with a metal detector into the garbage dump area and just see what we can find and what kind of artifacts and things might be out there. But it's about 6 miles north, but the roads have changed so much in the days, and the little monument was at the exit, at the little park there in the exit, and like I said, the metal thieves kept stealing the plaque, so they moved it down to Sirocco where there's more people to kind of keep it over. But I'd love to go out there. That's one of my next desert adventures. If I can figure out where that was at, I'd love to go out there.
Lead a party.
There you go. We can get 6 people in the Hummer.
Hey.
Anybody else?
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much for listening. I'm glad I did mention the